Hello everyone, it's your host Tony. Welcome to Actually Existing Socialism, a podcast dedicated to exploring past, present, and future manifestations of real-world socialism by speaking to those who've studied, lived in, or currently live in a socialist nation. For this episode, we have an excellent and in-depth discussion with Alice and Dennis Bartels. Alice was a field associate with the Department of Ethnology at the Royal Ontario Museum. Her husband and research partner, Dennis Bartels, was associate professor of anthropology, sociology, social cultural studies at Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada. We cover in this two-part discussion the culmination of decades of their detailed study on the Indigenous populations, also known as the Northern peoples of the Soviet Union, particularly the experience of these populations before, during, and after Soviet socialism, and how those experiences compare to those of the Indigenous Métis and Inuit peoples of North America who continue to live under the settler colonialist regimes of Canada and the United States. In this first part, the Bartels described the experience of both visiting and living in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, how the Cold War impacted their ethnographic research, a brief modern history of the Northern peoples, how one became a Communist Party member, as well as a glimpse as to how those capitalist and neoliberal reforms devastated these populations after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what we cover. Articles written by the Bartels and more info regarding our discussion today are freely accessible on the Patreon posting of this episode at patreon.com/AESthepodcast. The show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute as a subscriber, you gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content. If you're unable to contribute, no problem. You can help out by sharing this episode and others with friends and colleagues, and by following us on Twitter at AESthepodcast. You can also subscribe to this show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. But most importantly, you can help out by engaging in local worker struggles, whatever form that may be. The opening interlude for this episode features a reading from a seminal text regarding the Bolsheviks' policy towards the diverse nationalities, including the indigenous northern peoples that exist in what would become the Soviet Union. The name of the text is Marxism and the National Question, and it was written in 1913 by Joseph Drugashvili, who would become better known under his revolutionary moniker, Joseph Stalin.
But the policy of nationalist persecution is dangerous to the case of the proletariat, also on another account. It diverts the attention of large strata from the social questions, questions of the class struggle, to national questions, questions common to the proletariat and bourgeoisie. But this creates a favorable soil for lying propaganda about harmony of interests, for glossing over the class interests of the proletariat, and for the intellectual enslavement of the workers. This creates a serious obstacle to the cause of uniting the workers of all nationalities. But the policy of persecution does not stop there. It's not infrequently passed from a system of oppression to a system of inciting nations against each other, to a system of massacres and pogroms, divide and rule. Such is the purpose of the policy of incitement, and where such a policy succeeds, it is a tremendous evil for the proletariat and a serious obstacle to the cause of uniting the workers of all nationalities in the state. But the workers are interested in the complete amalgamation of all their fellow workers into a single international army, in their speedy and final emancipation from intellectual bondage to the bourgeoisie, and in the full and free development of the intellectual forces to their brothers, whatever nation they may belong to. The workers therefore combat and will continue to combat the policy of national oppression in all its forms, from the most subtle to the most crude, as well as the policy of inciting nations against each other in all its forms. Social democracy in all countries therefore proclaims the right of nations to self-determination. The right of self-determination means that only the nation itself has the right to determine its destiny, that no one has the right forcibly to interfere in the life of the nation, to destroy its schools and other institutions, to violate its habits and customs, to repress its language, or curtail its rights. This, of course, does not mean that social democracy will support every custom and institution of a nation. While combating the coercion of any nation, it will uphold only the right of the nation itself to determine its own destiny, at the same time agitating against harmful customs and institutions of that nation in order to enable the toiling strata of the nation to emancipate themselves from them. The right of self-determination means that a nation may arrange its life in the way it wishes. It has the right to arrange its life on the basis of autonomy. It has the right to enter into federal relations with other nations. It has the right to complete succession. Nations are sovereign, and all nations have equal rights. This, of course, does not mean that social democracy will support every demand of a nation. A nation has the right even to return to the old order of things, but this does not mean that social democracy will subscribe to such a decision if taken by some institution of a particular nation. The obligation of social democracy, which defends the interests of the proletariat, and the right of a nation, which consists of various classes, are two different things. In fighting for the right of nations to self-determination, the aim of social democracy is to put an end to the policy of national oppression, to render it impossible, and thereby to remove the grounds of strife between nations, to take the edge off that strife and reduce it to a minimum. That is what essentially distinguishes the policy of the class-conscious proletariat from the policy of the bourgeoisie, which attempts to aggregate and fan the national struggle and to prolong and sharpen the national movement. And that is why the class-conscious proletariat cannot rally under the national flag of the bourgeoisie. The fate of a national movement, which is essentially a bourgeois movement, is naturally bound up with the fate of the bourgeoisie. The final disappearance of a national movement is possible only with the downfall of the bourgeoisie. Only under the reign of socialism can peace be fully established. But even within the framework of capitalism, it is possible to reduce the national struggle to a minimum, to undermine it at the root, to render it harmless as possible to the proletariat. It requires that the country should be democratized and the nations be given the opportunity of free development.
So I'd like to welcome both Dennis and Alice Bartels to the program. Thank you so much for being here, both of you.
Thank you. Thanks for asking.
In 1995, When the North Was Red, Aboriginal Education in Soviet Siberia was published by McGill's Queen's University Press. This text was born out of decades of both of your excellently thorough research and included on-the-ground visits and extensive interviews with the varied northern peoples of the Soviet Union. Could you explain what led both of you to study these marginalized populations on the other side of the world and ultimately visit many of these communities at the height of Cold War tensions? And can you address how Cold War ideology impacted your field of study?
I was the first of the two of us to get interested in this issue because when I graduated from U of A, my first job came out of I was volunteering with a friend who was involved with this project, Boyle Street Information Center, which was run by the Edmonton Native Brotherhood Association. And they gave me a job for 6 months, which was very, very nice for me. They got a grant. It was probably the best job ever because I learned an incredible amount. But I couldn't see a way out for Native people. It seemed to me they were blocked both ends. You know, it was put up as a question of maintaining traditions and language or assimilating. And it seemed to me that neither was being made possible. They could not maintain traditions unless they had land resources and a place to do that, which were largely gone. And they couldn't assimilate because there was maybe still is, and pretty incredible racism against Indigenous people in Alberta. You can't assimilate if nobody will let you do anything that's get you into other jobs and so on. So I thought they were really stuck, mostly. There were, of course, individuals who triumphed over all of this racism and so on and managed to make very good lives for themselves and also a lot of contributions to Canada. But for most people, I felt it was an impossible battle at that time. And then we encountered the book that was written, that was in 1969, and we encountered a book, I guess it was 1970-ish, Farley Mowat, who went to visit the Soviet Union and met with a lot of people that were in a similar situation there. That is it's hard to know whether to use the word indigenous, but the people who were the northern peoples of the Soviet Union. And it seemed that they had avoided that kind of false choice situation there, that they were giving a lot of support to languages and to training for traditional occupations that would bring them more up to date, like veterinarian training and so on for people looking after reindeer. So we thought maybe there was something to look at there in terms of trying to learn what possibilities there might actually be for Canada. So that was my story. That was why I got interested. Oh, and another part of my story is that my parents were both accused of being communists in the United States. So we're living in Canada because of that. They were unable to get any jobs there. So I wasn't really afraid of the Soviet Union or those terms, because I'd had experiences through my parents that made me think there's stuff there worth looking at rather than being hostile.
Dennis, anything you want to add to that? Or
I would visit Alice at her workplace sometimes, and it was incredibly interesting. And, her boss was a native Cree speaker, and we could hear stories from him about running away from residential schools. And also, I was heavily influenced by Farley Mowat's book, Sibir. It's very interesting. I reread it to prepare for this podcast, and it's very interesting to look back on it now in light of what's happened.
I'd like you to address how you think Cold War ideology at the time impacted your field of study when you were getting into it. Were there certain roadblocks you faced, or I guess maybe perceptions at home that confined your research in any way?
Very much. I was a graduate student in anthropology at the time, and there was the Siberian Indigenous peoples, especially the smaller groups, were simply not covered in graduate courses in different culture areas. They weren't discussed, which was remarkable because at the University of Alberta Library, there are some of the best ethnographic works that's ever been written in English about some of these Siberian groups. And we were not told about these ethnographies. We had to learn about them later on our own. That was a major effect of Cold War ideology, in my opinion.
And it also meant that people weren't very receptive to what we had to say about it when we did come back, went to conferences. It was very difficult to get across the idea that this should be taken seriously by Canadians as a way to tackle some of our problems in terms of, well, in particular, for me, language preservation, I think is so crucial. They were doing a good job of it there in the Soviet Union, as far as we could see. We were not doing much of a job at all here.
At that time.
Languages get lost. They don't come back unless you somehow can record them before they go, at least.
Yeah, so those were some of the effects of Cold War ideology on our research.
Also, there's another part, and that was that we arrived there in Leningrad all bushy-tailed, and they think, who the heck are you? And there was a fair bit of suspicion, I think, and rightly so. I mean, it would be up either direction. So that was a bit of an uphill battle when we first got there to get people to let us into the Herzen Pedagogical Institute. Was hard.
That's where most of the northern students were studying to become teachers of their native languages back in their native regions. One of the reasons we chose to study there is because that's where they were all concentrated. We weren't going to be allowed to go to all these different parts of the Siberian North and Far East, but all these students were concentrated in one place. So that made it a natural goal for us to interview them, but it wasn't always easy to get access because of suspicion, and it seemed perfectly understandable that happened. But we did get access.
And we didn't get access. We didn't encounter suspicion from the northern peoples. It was from the people in charge of the institute, or, kind of the local Leningraders were a little bit more wary of us. And we had our kids with us. And so we had the experience of them going to a school there, a regular local school, but it was one that specialized in teaching English. So it was in our neighborhood. So it made sense for them to go because, at least by our older daughter's age, a lot of the kids knew some English. The younger daughter had to learn Russian pretty fast.
And she did.
So that sounds like such a fascinating experience, and a perfect segue into our next question. So what was the experience like of, visiting and living in the Soviet Union? Is there a specific memory that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I did. But first of all, there was a language barrier. We were never fluent in Russian, although we learned a lot of specialized vocabulary for the research about occupations and educational levels and so on. But we had to learn about shopping, driving. We had a car with us, a Lada.
We bought in Halifax.
Taking public transport, and of course, getting our kids settled in school. One of my favorite memories, though, was about our supervisor, who is himself an Indigenous person. His name was Chunar Taksami. He was from the Nivk nationality, in the Amur River region in far eastern Siberia. It's not that far from the Chinese border. He was an ethnographer, a cultural anthropologist, as we would say. He was a full member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and he was the elected head of the Siberia department at Leningrad's Institute of Ethnography. Most of the other ethnographers in that department who were full-time were women. And Dr. Taksami would come in when everybody would be there for work, and he would make tea for everybody, including us, with this in this kettle that was plugged into this incredibly dodgy electrical surface, which would spark. It terrified me. I had to do it once. Anyway.
I'd like to add that this was in a museum with a lot of valuable stuff in it, and if it had burned down,
it would be irreplaceable.
It would have been pretty awful.
But anyway, Taksami was born in 1931 in far eastern Siberia. He grew up with a native lifestyle.
On the Amur River.
And he died in 2014. So that's one of my favorite reminiscences.
He was very good to us. Once he could understand what we really wanted to do there.
He's the one who paved the way for us in getting us access to the students at the Herzen Pedagogical Institute. I can remember he was a short guy striding through the gate, looking tough, going to tell the administrators to let us in.
Yeah, he was angry on our behalf, which was great for us.
Oh, gosh.
And they did let us in because he knew all those people. He was involved with a lot of the same stuff, so I could think they could trust him at least.
And he was a full member of the Academy of Sciences. You know, couldn't argue very well with that.
He actually got a trip after the end of the Soviet Union. He was on a trip it was before the end of the Soviet Union. He was on a group tour of, I guess, northern educators from the Soviet Union to Canada. And we saw him after that. And he said to us, all these children having children, because they'd taken them to different reserves and so on. And he was very upset that he was seeing all these very young girls who were having babies. And there were a couple of other things he noticed too. I guess they had been led to believe that they would see how things really ought to be done for northern peoples from, in Canada. And he was quite puzzled when he saw what was happening here at that time. That would have been in 85 or so.
Around there, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he sounds like he was a great advocate for both of you and your family in being there. Did you have a specific reminiscence or memory, Alice, that you wanted to add?
Well, I guess one of my strongest ones was when we first got to Leningrad and we had to take our kids over to register them in the school. And it was as I said, it was an English-speaking school in a way because, the kids started at 7, but by the time they were 10, they already knew some English, and a lot of the teachers were excellent English speakers. But we met with the principal, a woman who did not speak English. They were all elected offices. Like the teachers elected their principal, and I had been trained in teaching and had done some teaching at that point, and I thought, I would really like to have the chance to elect my boss. Anyway, so she was interviewing us, and the interpreter was a woman who was an English teacher, who was also the vice principal, and was a retired opera singer. And she was dressed in this very dramatic way, and she had this very long black hair that sort of was, anyway, it was all very dramatic. I could see her on the stage. They told us how the school, we might not like the school too much for our kids. Were we sure we wanted to send them there because they were very strict? We had just walked in through the hallways where the kids were playing tag and shouting. And I thought, coming from Newfoundland, they were not strict at all because Newfoundland, you could not run in the halls. You certainly couldn't play any games in the halls. And you had to keep your voice down. Maybe coming from a different school system, we wouldn't have noticed that it was a lot more liberal there for the kids than it was
where we were living.
Yeah. But that was the big memory for me because I was quite concerned about where our kids were going to be. They did pretty well. Jessie learned a lot of Russian.
The younger one.
And the older one learned a lot of a kind of a Creole. We would hear her talking with her friends on the phone, and it would be English and Russian words mixed up, and the English words would have a strong Russian accent. Dennis was talking about the Russian language. Before we went to take a summer course in Russian at Middlebury College in Vermont, which has wonderful language program. And we did learn a fair bit of Russian there.
Both of those sound like very colorful memories. How long did you guys live there for?
We were there for 8 months the first time. And then the second time we went, we were there for about 6 weeks.
Right.
And the third time we were there for 3 months.
That's correct.
And that was in 89. We left late November 89 when everything was really
falling apart.
Upon your return to Canada from these different trips, did you ever feel like you were, how should I put this, maybe under suspicion from any Canadian agency or?
When we were there in 86, I guess it was, or was it 89? We had to collect our mail at that time. That was the only time we were there kind of with the exchange program between Canada and the Soviet Union, because before that it had been canceled. And we were there with a SSHRC grant, Social Sciences and Humanities Research grant. So kind of unofficially, but this time we were there officially, and we had to collect our mail from the embassy in Moscow. And there we found out that everybody else, all the other Canadians that would go back and forth to the Soviet Union, would get debriefed when they came back by the RCMP. Nobody ever asked us.
We were never debriefed.
So it was kind of reverse. We were less watched.
A special privilege, you might say.
Yeah.
Few today, except the most reactionary commentators, would argue that life in the Tsarist Empire leading up to the October Revolution in 1917 was not marked by stark inequality and suffering for the vast majority of peoples. But even these accurate popular historic accounts generally focus on the peasant classes of ethnic Russians. Can you shed some light on what life was like for northern peoples under Tsarist rule? How is it similar or dissimilar to the experience of First Nations, Native Americans, and Indigenous peoples of the Americas under Western European colonization?
There were some parallels, quite a few actually, between European expansion in Canada and expansion from Western Russia into Siberia. It happened a little later in Canada, but in Siberia, there are repeated attempts at military conquest by Cossack expeditions. The main parallel was the fur trade. And from the fur trade, the profits in both cases went mainly to elites or capitalist classes in metropolitan centers in London, Moscow, Paris, and later St. Petersburg. And in both cases, European diseases decimated a lot of northern populations, in particular smallpox and measles. There are very comprehensive accounts of contact in Siberia by very well-known and influential Soviet ethnographers, in particular a man by the name of Bogaras. So those are some of the main things I can think of.
And I think alcohol was used very similar ways in both places. People bringing it in to deliberately addict other people, or to at least get them too drunk to be able to make a good deal for themselves in negotiations. Plenty of that happened both places. One of the things that struck us too was that we saw pictures of the early, about 100 years before it was happening in the United States and here, was pictures of forts, and they looked very much like Fort Edmonton. You know, they were very similar kind of structures, even though they were earlier.
Yeah, those are a lot of the parallels.
But the main difference, I think, was reindeer.
Oh, yeah.
And the role of reindeer. In Siberia, for most of the native groups, not all, reindeer was really the main part of their economy and culture. And in North America, I don't think there were ever, even now, any satisfactory reindeer herds. You know, they don't seem to do so well over here.
According to Farley Mowat, and this part of the book I think still stands up, Sibir, published in 1970, is that there were attempts to introduce reindeer breeding commercially in Alaska and in Canada. And in both cases, they were basically stopped by the beef industry. It was an aspect of capitalism that I think toward the end of the Soviet Union, a lot of people didn't understand about how capitalism works in this way, and how competition, so-called, can mean basically stopping certain positive possibilities of development.
There was a big range of reindeer, the way that reindeer were used. In some groups, they used them for all sorts of things, like transportation, to ride on them, to eat them, to make clothing out of their hides and so on. And in other places, they really just had big herds and hunted them every so often. So there was quite a range. A lot of the groups that didn't have reindeer as the center of their economy. When we were there, some of those groups were trying to incorporate that into their culture because they felt that was a real northern thing to do, I guess.
From what I'm getting from that, the reindeer were essentially the buffalo of that region for the indigenous peoples there, because I know buffalo was an important animal for a variety of reasons in North America for different indigenous populations.
There were some parallels
for the hunters.
For the hunters. But, the buffalo could never be used for, riding and
domesticated. They
weren't domesticated. But in many cases, the reindeer were. And so, there's still reindeer breeding in post-Soviet Siberia, although it's greatly reduced in scale.
And also in Scandinavia. It spilled over from, that whole northern region. They had reindeer is very crucial.
Yeah, in Sweden and Norway.
Finland.
Was there any equivalent to the assimilation policies under Tsarist rule for those regions?
They did have, in some places, Russian Orthodox missionaries would go and establish schools. And they did have, of course, this, fur trade connection. But I think because the Tsarist government was never able to subdue all of the peoples.
No.
Some of them, they just never could, like the Chukchi were never conquered. But they did have trade connections. It wasn't as absolute, I guess, in a way, as it was here.
In some cases, the Tsarist authorities just realized that it cost more to try and conquer them than to not conquer them. So they claim, you have to give us tribute, and they never got it. So it was kind of interesting. It varied from group to group.
Partly geography. The Chukchi were the furthest away.
Farthest east, yeah. And there was also contact in the Far East with China. That brought interesting contact issues also involving trade.
And cultural influences. There are some groups that existed on both sides of the border. And you could tell by what they were producing in terms of clothing and decorations that they were very influenced by China, as were we all.
Right.
So the Soviet Union from the beginning embarked on a unique nationalities policy to account for their incredibly diverse population and to act in accordance with their Marxist-Leninist principles. Such a policy, from what I understand, has only really been attempted again on such a large scale in post-revolutionary China. Can you explain what this nationalities policy was and how various northern peoples figured into it?
Early Soviet policy was based on what was interpreted as Lenin's view that northern peoples, with the help of the new Soviet state, could build socialist nations based on common language, territory, and culture. At the same time, not all aspects of traditional northern cultures were allowed to persist. Blood feuds, forced marriage, bride price, punishment involving humiliation and torture were simply made illegal, and the law was enforced when possible. Traditional occupations, in particular reindeer breeding, were to be reorganized on a cooperative basis, so there'd be collective ownership of resources. Culture bases for northern groups were to become national capitals, and culture bases had meeting halls, medical and veterinary clinics, boarding schools, cinemas, and cooperative shops, which sold staples such as fish hooks, kettles, and ammunition. That was the basis of the nationalities policy.
So they were pursuing the consolidation, which meant that their culture should be still developed and developing by the people themselves, which involved a lot of the, making it a written language, producing things that were in that language that were valuable to the people that were using the language, like textbooks, but also other kinds of instruction manuals and local newspapers, radio stations using their language. We're sort of barely edging into some of that now when you'll have a hockey game that has a person who speaks Cree
right,
doing the announcing of the hockey game. But they were doing that kind of thing
a lot earlier.
The other part of the policy was Sovietization, which meant that they would be part of the new country, which it was. One of the things I thought made it more successful at the time there was that it wasn't just Native people who were being asked to make big changes. Everybody's life was changing completely in every possible way. There was pretty much 90% illiteracy rate among Russians. And everybody was being forced to go to school, and not just one group of people. Everybody had a right to a job, but not only a right to a job, but an obligation to do a job. And that applied across the country. I think that makes it easier, if everybody's having to change. It's not somebody being asked to become you, right? We're saying, you become like us. And then that's, all the work is on their side. We felt that wasn't what had happened. We weren't there when that was going on, but that wasn't what was happening when they were starting this new direction.
Are you saying that the Soviet system was not working towards a policy of assimilation, accommodation? Like, what would the...
Well, assimilation to me means that somebody becomes like somebody else. And it seemed to me that what they were talking about in Sovietization was that everybody was becoming the new person. Everybody was expecting to be different. Now, not just
to be literate, that their traditional occupations would be organized on a cooperative basis. But that wasn't just true for northern peoples, it was true for everybody.
Collective farms throughout.
Collective farms.
With some problems in all of the areas.
Always.
That seemed to me to be quite a big difference between what we could hope to do here.
World War I, the October Revolution, and then the Russian Civil War, did that have like an impact on northern peoples? Were they engaged in those conflicts?
Yes, they were. In some cases, they were not. They were isolated from it. But in others, you had small native groups or parts of native groups fighting on one side or the other. So in far eastern Siberia, you had people joining the Red forces. In other parts, some of the groups supported the whites. So yes, they were involved.
Well, it was the Hanti that had some on each side.
The Hanti had groups on each side.
They're Western Siberia.
And in far eastern Siberia, the ones who fought were fighting for the Reds.
The White Russians did go to parts of Siberia and wreak havoc and killed local people who were interested in the new systems, the socialists. And we talked to somebody, actually, we interviewed somebody. I think we talk about him in our book a bit. He was a linguist living in Leningrad. So we had a chance to interview him quite a bit. And he'd acted when he was a young person, he'd been an interpreter at some of the trials of some of these White Russians who had been murdering people. That's something that's often not well known. And that is that, the opposition to the Reds were pretty awful. They were killing a lot of innocent people who weren't involved in the conflict at all. Like teachers. They were singling out teachers, apparently, around where he was.
To kill them
because they were influencing the younger people to look at socialism in a favorable way.
It's very interesting to contrast the account of some of these events that was given to us by this older fellow who is a Hunt interpreter when he was very young and witnessed some of these events, with accounts from some American anthropologists who have a completely different version. We have one article that we wrote about that, looking at this contrast. It allows interesting perspectives on cultural relativism, how cultures are judged.
And also within even the smallest groups, there are different interests. So you'd have a person whose interest is in keeping things exactly as they are. And then you have a whole lot of other people maybe who are young and don't have any reindeer themselves yet. They're interested in something quite different. They can play on each side. And including different interests between men and women within a culture.
Both of the things you said were very insightful. To your point, Alice, the focus of terror in these kind of revolutionary periods are often attributed to the Red Terror, or the focus is on the different atrocities that may have been committed by socialist forces and not so much on the White Terror, as you mentioned. As I believe in a lot of revolutionary conflicts, whether in Cuba, in China and Russia and other places, teachers often do find themselves as being attacked by the white forces, the so-called white forces, the anti-communist forces, because you say they have a huge impact on educating children and adults to hopefully build a better future together. So that's a very, very good point. When it comes to thinking about the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War that, followed it, prior to this conversation that we're having right now, I never really considered the northern peoples and how they figured into it. The images in my head, of course, are of those of Moscow and stuff like that, of people on the streets and the fighting that occurs around there.
There was another little bit that Dennis has been looking at too, and that is that the role of the Japanese, because they were coming in from the other side at different periods, but including at that time, they were interested in grabbing some of the Russian territory, as pre-Soviet,
they still
for
are.
themselves. There's still debate about the island of Sakhalin, for example.
The Kurils. To get some idea of the Japanese in far eastern Siberia, there's a book by an American general named Graves. I believe it's William Graves, who commanded the American troops in far eastern Siberia. And in his book about that, he has really interesting observations, firsthand observations about what the Japanese were doing there when they went in to overthrow the Bolsheviks, and collaborating in some respects with the American forces to do that.
Was that about 1924-ish?
It was around, the Japanese forces were not defeated and forced out of Siberia until 1924, which is very, very late. And people often don't realize that.
And I think people often don't even realize that, as you kind of alluded to, that during the Russian Civil War, the United States, Great Britain, Japan, as you mentioned, and a whole bunch of other Western,
France,
or
Italy,
not all Western, but
Canada,
yes, exactly, yeah. All these countries invaded and participated on behalf of the Tsarist forces. So that is something I definitely did not learn in school.
Was it Italy where the troops all mutinied and refused to take part? Or which country? There was one country where they just...
Well, there are several mutinies among the intervention forces, including certainly among French forces and even among some of the British forces, which is quite interesting, and also the Italian forces. After the First World War, a lot of the soldiers wanted to go home. Yeah. they didn't see why they should be sent to Russia. I think that's one of the reasons the Civil War went the way it did.
Not the way the French Commune.
Not the way the French Commune, exactly.
Yeah.
What perspectives, both positive and negative, do Northern peoples generally have towards the Soviet system and the process of Sovietization? How did this change over time, and who are the types of people who supported the Soviet system and benefited materially from it, and who opposed these new reforms?
Rich reindeer breeders were supposed to provide meat and reindeer to poor relatives, customarily. Sometimes they did. Fairly often they didn't. So some of the poor reindeer breeders supported co-ops that were formed with reindeer that were forcibly expropriated from large herds to form co-ops. And I only learned this recently. To avoid losing their herds, some of the rich reindeer breeders took their reindeer to China, in particular the ones that lived on both sides. The ones that lived on both sides. As far as I know, nobody has done research on that.
That would be an interesting project.
That would be a wonderful project.
Some young person.
In some cases, collectivization was forced too rapidly, and reindeer herds declined, especially if they didn't get enough, co-ops didn't get enough support. But what's interesting about the Soviet policy is that when they declined, collectivization was stopped. And not all the traditional occupations were collectivized until the 1960s. There were still some, in particular, reindeer breeding groups that were fairly isolated. I mean, they'd have contact, but their herds were not collectivized until quite late. In many cases, shamans. Traditionally, shamans opposed Soviet policies. It was widely believed traditionally that shamans could intercede with supernatural forces to control the weather, to boost availability of game animals or fish, to heal sickness and so on. But in exchange for this, they would receive gifts. For example, sable pelts or reindeer. So some shamans became very rich reindeer breeders. But when Northerners were organized into co-ops, then there had to be a collective decision, not just an individual decision, about whether or not they were going to give gifts to shamans in exchange for their services. That was a reason that the shamans did not like Northerners to go into Soviet institutions. So some, but not all, shamans urged Northerners to stay out of cooperatives and so on. But one of the Northern students whom we met in Leningrad in 1982, a young Hunt woman, said that her grandfather had been a shaman. She didn't say, and we didn't ask, we probably should have, if he was persecuted in any way. But it was interesting that she felt that she should mention it.
They were changing so fast, like every part of the Soviet Union, they were changing so fast and people were none of this is easy. I don't want to make it sound like we thought that what they were doing was in any way easy or that there weren't things that were done that were unfair to individual people. But I still think that the processes that they set in motion were the right ones. For any place where you have issues that you have majorities and minorities, or where you have different, in the case of the Soviet Union when it took over, it was big class interests were, they were very different, very divided classes. None of that was easy. None of it happened without problems. And I think that was still continuing at the end of the Soviet Union. One of the problems at the end of the Soviet Union that we noticed a lot was that too many people seemed to be not interested in pursuing the traditional occupations. Well, I have to say the traditional occupations were really hard. And, following a reindeer herd around on the tundra is not a piece of cake. And a lot of people were moving into some other kinds of occupations, teachers, doctors, veterinarians, very highly educated professions, but also other levels of occupations that they wanted to pursue, young people. So the idea, particularly women, So the idea was they were going to bring in, this was in 89, they were going to bring in what they called family contracts, where a family would have to sign a contract to do the traditional occupation and to produce so many reindeer or whatever for sale. It was an attempt to force the women and children into going along with because mostly the people who seemed to be interested in maintaining traditional occupations were the men, because I guess they had the upper hand in those traditional occupations. They were having a hard time getting the women to go along, and the women wanted to stay in a center where they could have better medical care. They could have their kids going to school during the day only, not at a boarding school. So there was quite a division on that. And I was very worried. I think you were too. What would these marriage contracts do to the women and the children?
Right.
Who would be held responsible for a failure in a contract? Or what would be the penalties?
What if a marriage broke up?
What if the woman said, no, I'm not going out onto the tundra, thanks very much. I'm going to stay here and do my job. They were librarians. They were, there was all kinds of other occupations that had been opened up. So that's a dilemma. So how do you preserve a traditional occupation? And how do you make sure that individual choices can be,
One thing that was very clear during early Soviet times was that a lot of Northern women became supporters of Soviet policy. They liked abolition of menstrual huts. They liked abolition of forced marriage, of a man being able to have more than one wife, and getting rid of bride price. And they liked opportunities for waged labor. For example, in co-op shops, where they would be independent from male authority. And not a lot has been written about that. Anybody who says that all the traditional cultures, all aspects of traditional cultures were just simply done away with because Native people resisted completely, that's just not true. A lot of Northern women benefited greatly, materially, from the new Soviet institutions.
But then there was the same discussion. Okay, so you're going to make menstrual huts illegal. I mean, you have to remember that this was Siberia, cold winters. Sometimes the women didn't survive a menstrual hut. They were also expected to give birth there. And sometimes the baby or the mother didn't survive. I mean, it was not medically sound practice. But then what do you do? Like, do you say, well, that's been a part of your culture forever, but you have to stop it now? Like, how do you handle these kinds of situations? I feel that especially maybe since the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, that it's way past time for us to do very honest assessments of all of these kinds of questions, because they pursued a very different way than we have in a lot of ways. And we can get another angle at attacking these problems. Whose interests do you defend? It's what it often comes down to. I have my opinion, but it might not be someone else's opinion. These are fundamental issues to improving our societies at different times in different ways, different issues, but basically it's the same issue. That is, whose interests do you go for and why? What's your rationale for saying we're going to do this? I think the Soviets were right to get rid of the menstrual huts. But there were some people who, I have to say, some people who have a bit of a vested interest in maintaining cultures are not necessarily the people who have to live in them.
No. It was my observation that some of the northern political leaders who were very upset about young people not preferring to pursue traditional occupations were ones who did not themselves pursue traditional occupations.
Somebody else should pursue this traditional occupation and keep it alive.
Right.
Looking at ways to reassess the Soviet history now that it's ended is definitely one of the focuses of this podcast, to give people now, especially people like myself born after 1990, a look into the past to hopefully develop a better future, the knowledge that we learned from the past.
There's a lot of information, I think, that we're just not accessing.
We're not accessing, or it's just hard or impossible to access, especially in English when it comes to a lot of this stuff. I'll bring up the example of the country that my parents were born in, Nigeria. In the late 20th century, early 20th century, the British colonized Nigeria. And through that process, there was a change in the societal structures, the cultures, their practices, etc. Much of it was imposed by the British. You discussing the Soviet implementation of some of these policies reminded me of this, in the sense that a lot of negative practices like slavery and other things that, of course, are not great for human flourishing, were opposed by the British. With that said, they went about it in a much different way than it sounds like the Soviet experiment, in the sense that they removed democratic forms of leadership, for example. They imposed religious kind of things to follow. So Christianity is an example of that. And so they did tackle certain kind of reactionary forces, but then also brought in their own colonial reactionary forces to replace it, rather than a reduction of these kind of class, gender, and race constructs that are imposed on people.
Yeah,
that's quite interesting.
And it's a worldwide problem. It's something that's happened in everywhere, even in Britain, where with the issues with Welsh and Scottish and Irish, and without even leaving their own territory, it was already, or things like Christianity moving in. You read about early Christianity and how it moved into different places, or it was or different forms of Christianity. You think of Martin Luther King days, when some local ruler would decide in Germany, in what became Germany. Martin Luther. That was Martin Luther King was much better.
Yes, he certainly was.
Martin Luther, when he was creating a kind of Protestantism, and some local ruler would say, "Okay, now we're all going to be Protestants," and everybody had to become a Protestant.
Yeah.
What do? You want to move ahead. You want to make things better, but are you going to be able to find a way to do it which actually makes them better, or doesn't trade one bad thing for another bad thing?
Right.
Both of you have touched on this, that the early Soviet Union was recovering from years of war. And so there was a strong revolutionary fervor to tackle important problems, but there wasn't necessarily the infrastructure or the ability to enforce certain things or the ability to maintain certain systems, especially at that early period. I believe, at least from a book I've read recently, they discussed how Russia and other kind of Tsarist countries, their level of development was what Great Britain's was in the 1600s in 1917. And so the ability to bring about socialism, of course, was greatly hampered by that fact. I guess I never told you how I found your work. So do you know the app TikTok?
Yes.
Oh, we know about it.
Yes, I don't have it. Yeah, because I've been told I'm too old to have it.
Fair enough. TikTok, there was a Yakut woman who had made a short TikTok explaining how her parents received free university education because of, communism in the Soviet Union at the time. And then this, was shocking to the people on TikTok who, watch videos on TikTok, because, most of them are under 30. And all they heard about the Soviet Union as oppression and everything is gray and bleak and stuff like that. And so there's, like a back and forth between her and other people on this platform. And I saw this, and I was like, oh, this is very interesting. I'm interested in Soviet history, but I've never really, learned about the northern peoples. And so I did some Googling based on that to see like how accurate her information she's presenting was and what other people's comments were. And that led me to finding your book online. A very, very strange circumstance, but a worthwhile one for sure.
Well, that's very interesting because the Yakut, or as they call themselves now, Sakha, they're a very large group. They number 300,000. That's about the same as the Navajo in the United States. So in Soviet times, they were not considered one of the small peoples. The ones we are mainly looking at, there were about 26 officially designated groups who numbered in total at the time about 180,000. But some of them were very close to the Sakha Yakut people and went to university, as she did, in Yakutia.
They had their own university with using their own language.
Right.
I guess as well as Russian. They had a lot more status, and they had more institutions that they could have themselves because they were so numerous. But some of the people lived in the area, which was the Yakut area, who weren't Yakut, but they would go, like Yukagir, which was a very small group.
And
Dolgan, who were probably a branch of Yakut. The languages were very close. It was a very different situation. And the Komi also had the same situation. They were in the European part of
but they were, again, a very large group, 300,000 again.
Yeah, they had a lot more going for them.
It was interesting, the TikTok itself, because there was a lot of back and forth between people in regards to their families' experiences under socialism and communism in the Eastern Bloc. It all varied, right? Everything wasn't the same and at all the same times. And so very interesting historical discussion on a platform that is known for just people doing dances and doing funny things. So the process of Sovietization impacted all ethnic groups in the Soviet Union in a dramatic fashion. How did the life and culture of northern peoples of the USSR stay the same and or change during the ongoing process of Sovietization?
I thought of an example. Most Russian and Ukrainian peasants, and they were the largest groups, didn't have any knowledge of mechanized agriculture, and they were largely illiterate. During the early 5-year plans, they started getting tractors. That was completely new for them. And they were learning to read. Similarly, northern peoples learned that traditional occupations, some of them, could be mechanized. For example, they could learn to fish from motorized boats instead of oared boats. So that was new. And newly developed written languages for northern peoples could help familiarize them with these processes. For example, they could see pictures in their textbooks of motorboats, and they could learn bookkeeping based on elementary mathematics from these new textbooks. Like the first Chukchi textbook had stylized reindeer to learn addition and subtraction. I thought it was wonderful to see those. Thank goodness we got a copy of that and got it here. So those are some of the examples that I can remember.
I think a lot of people would feel that they gained more than they lost during that period. And my feeling was, and again, these are impressions, we didn't do a study of it or anything, but my feeling was that there was an awful lot of trust in the Communist Party among the Native people that we met, including a lot that weren't members and probably never intended to become members. One of the things we learned there is to become a member of the Communist Party meant basically that you took on a third job if you were a woman and a second job if you were a man. Women were expected to do their work. They weren't to be housekeepers. And they were also expected to maintain the house. And then they were expected to take on a very heavy volunteer job. So, for example, the dorm, where 2 floors of which at the first while we were there, the first trip, were for the students from the far north. The rest of the dorm was for just other students that were going to the Herzen Pedagogical Institute from all over the place. And the woman who was she was a volunteer matron. She was the French teacher, one of the French teachers at the Herzen Pedagogical Institute. And she had to go there several times a week just to make sure that the students were doing all right and look after the actual physical building. They're part of it. It was a big job. There was a woman another one in the Ethnographic Institute. Her job was to go around and take food orders. People would buy specialized food about once a month, I guess, like caviar, stuff like that, the sort of luxuries. Somebody would go around from their union. Their unions were very different from what I think of our unions. They looked after a lot of things like holidays. So all this applied to Northerners too. They got the same kind of organization. Anyway, it looked to me like it was a lot of work. And there were two ways that you could become a member that we found out about. One was that you would be so excellent in your schoolwork or your job that you would be invited to become a member. Or you'd apply to become a member and you'd go through quite a process of showing that you were, sincere and you were going to contribute. People who were communists were expected to contribute a lot with a lot of time.
Yeah.
And
not easy.
No, I hadn't realized any of that before we went. I was thinking it was like a political party here where you just sort of sign up and pay your
dues and maybe go to a few meetings or leaflet now and again.
Vote once in a while.
Right.
It was very, very different and a lot of responsibility, a lot of obligations. Oh, for where we lived in a flat and it was owned by the Academy of Sciences. And while we were there a couple of times, a very well-dressed woman came in to check our gas line. That was her volunteer job as a communist. So she would go around to it was a big building, to all of these units and gave me heart failure because she would hold a match.
Oh, God.
Next to the pipe.
Wow.
But
they're just fearless in the Soviet Union, I guess.
Well, that reminds me of Tatsami plugging in the kettle. Oh, the sparks.
Those were the most dangerous encounters we had, I guess. Maybe we should speak a little bit about the change between 1981-82 and 1989. When we were there in 86, we didn't actually spend much time at the Herzen Pedagogical Institute because we were there in the summer and the students were all away. When we went to the dorm, it was in 81-82, when we visited the dorm, students were there. They were in very, very large rooms with 4 beds. Students got, first of all, no tuition or anything. They got stipends. And if they did very well in their marks, they got rewards like TV. And I don't know how many rooms we went into where there'd be 4 TVs in the same room. All the students had done so well. The other thing was that they had a special, what they called a kitchen. They had a big cafeteria, but they had different areas in it. And one area had been brought in, I guess, in the 30s for a northern diet because they found that the students that were coming from the north, when they were eating standard Russian food, were getting sick. I guess it was probably what we're finding out about here, that it was not enough protein and too much carbs, too much kasha and not enough meat and fish. So they brought in a special kitchen. So we wanted to see it because we read about it. And one of the people who was a Herzen Pedagogical Institute administrator, she said, no, we don't have any. There's no such thing. It does not exist. And then she left. And the other woman that was there said, let's go for a cup of coffee. And we went and found that she took us to that kitchen. We found out a lot from her about it. It was not open not only to Northerners, but it was also open to anybody who had to be on a special diet for health reasons. So Russians who needed a higher protein diet, who were diabetic, I suppose, or something. We saw, and it was definitely much better food.
It was.
And we were told we were welcome to eat there whenever we wanted.
We didn't eat there very often, but we at least knew where it was.
It was interesting that the one woman felt that this was something that she shouldn't tell Westerners about. But it was actually, I thought, a good thing. It was something they should be proud of, that they've made this special provision to keep people healthy.
Cold War things. We were talking about the Communist Party and how it's different than, parties here at home. The NDP, the Liberal or Conservative Party, in the sense that there's a requirement to actually be active in some way. There's a social mobilization behind it rather than from just above dictates coming down. People are expected from the bottom up to be contributing. I know, for example, in China, during the current pandemic that's been going on, those kind of people committees there have been very effective in assisting people through the pandemic, providing food and providing tests and making sure people are safe that way. I do know, of course, in the Soviet Union, as you mentioned, it operated pretty similarly in that extent, but people were also stretched thin because of a variety of reasons: infrastructure, education, just the level of technology back in the day, no computers or anything like that. I know I've done another interview with someone where we discussed like 1930s, the Soviet Union in a particular region, Kirov, and how the Communist Party administrators there just had like a bike to get around.
Oh, yeah.
and that over like a huge region, right? So it was quite chaotic, but one had to be quite dedicated in order to actually serve.
When we went back in 89, this was after a few years with Gorbachev, and it was, I guess, shortly before the end, which we didn't realize, of course. The place was a dump.
It had fallen apart.
Both the program wasn't working and also the dorm was just a dump. First of all, they isolated the Northerners. Now, instead of having a lot of contact with students from other places, as they did in the original dorm, they had the whole building. It wasn't being maintained at all. The washrooms weren't working. It was to the point of disgusting in terms of the washrooms. In terms of the program, what was happening was that because of perestroika, etc., it was a bit of a free-for-all. So there were different interests within that program. There was one group that were very interested in preserving music and dance and art. And there was another part that was very interested in developing more of the languages and adding more languages to it. When we were first there, they didn't seem to be in opposition, but when we were there in 89, they were. And we'd be there, and then one day, this group would have gone to Moscow to agitate to get their side of the story, and they'd come back, and the whole curriculum would be changed. And then the next few days, the other group went, and they put up a fight, and then the curriculum changed again. So the students weren't getting classes because the classes were being canceled all the time, either because the professors were in Moscow agitating or because the classes had been changed to another class and they didn't know what to expect. The program just simply wasn't working really, as far as we could see, at all at that time for either group.
No.
I think that this glasnost perestroika stuff just sowed an awful lot of confusion and chaos.
To learn more about what was covered in this episode's discussion, check out the freely accessible Patreon posting at patreon.com/AES the podcast. And don't forget, this discussion with the Bartels will continue on into the next episode.